Good morning, everyone. In fact, we are very nicely poised for this discussion. We started off with fossil fuels, then we moved into minerals, and now we are coming to something extremely exciting, and that is solar energy. Sonal has earlier in the day talked about the 500 gigawatt target that India has set, of which a major part is going to come from solar energy. In fact, talking to executives in the industry, they say that they expect some 300 gigawatts out of the 500 to come from solar energy by 2030. But that is going to be extremely challenging, and today we'll come to know as to why that is exciting, at the same time a very, very challenging proposition. And we have got Mr. Srivatsan Iyer, who is the global CEO of Hero Future Energies, and I think we'll take that question to him first. We are already the third largest solar producer, and we have got 125 gigawatts as of now. While solar remains an extremely important component to reach our overall targets, it is going to be challenging at the same time, and we have been talking backstage about this also. Maybe if you could give us a lay down as to where we stand today, that could be a good opener, and then we can take it forward.
Absolutely. So thank you for having me. As you mentioned, if we were to meet our target of 500 gigawatts of clean energy by 2030, solar has to form a critical component of that. We are doing extremely well in that front. We've actually exceeded our intermediate targets already. Going forward, I think we require 2 to 3 discrete items to work flawlessly to reach our 500 gigawatt target. The first is for a domestic manufacturing value chain to establish itself. That way we can supply all of the components that we need to be able to meet a solar target of, let's call it 300 or 350. And I think we're already well on our way. The second is, and we keep talking about this transmission infrastructure, right? And it's not that it's not in plan, it's not like it's not being played out, except that a solar plant from concept to execution is a 24-month process, whereas a transmission line from, let's call it the western or southern parts of India where solar resources are high to the rest of India takes twice that amount of time and multiple times that amount of investment, right? So there's a timing mismatch. It's not a structural gap, it's more of a timing mismatch. And I believe the third piece that one needs to spend a little bit of time thinking about is we focus a lot on solar as being these mega projects. Clearly we've all heard of Kavda, 30 gigawatts in one location. I think the power of solar is that it can be a distributed form of energy. And we haven't spent enough time, I believe, as a country thinking about how do we encourage distributed generation on a large scale, and how do you integrate it to the grid without causing problems to the grid. So it's easy to say put up rooftop solar in the house, right? If every house does that, however, if they start exporting to the grid at random, right, the grid hasn't been modernized to a level to handle multiple generation points. And we talk distributed solar, we're talking tens of millions of them. That needs to be given a little bit of thought to in terms of what technology upgrades do we need to our grids, and what regulatory and policy modifications need to be made for DISCOMs to allow distributed manufacturing to even export to the grid in times of excess supply. And lastly, we spend all of our time in the country, and indeed, let's say, too much time talking about the supply side. Not enough time on the demand side. India is one of the few countries in the world where tariff is fixed throughout the day. So there's no market-based incentive for anybody to modulate demand. Whereas prices in peak hours tend to be 5-10x that of off-peak hours. And that's going to continue to grow and cause problems to the country unless we also have market-based reforms to say, manage your demand so there's a little more uniformity through the 24 hours rather than everybody gets a flat tariff and we continue to have these peak demands in the mornings and evenings. That causes problems not only to the generators but to grid stability as well.
Okay. So you have set the stage very clearly. Maybe we'll come to the specifics of that. Now we'll get Mr. Alexander Hogeveen-Rutter, who is a research manager at the third derivative, and you're doing a lot of work in terms of startups in the renewable sector is concerned. You're always on the lookout for opportunities. So maybe you could give us an idea of, how you look at India when it comes to the progress we have made so far. And are you optimistic that, we will be able to reach this kind of a target that we have set by 2030?
So first I want to echo everything Sri said. I think he was spot on. I actually am optimistic we can reach the 500 gigawatt target. I just don't think the 500 gigawatt target is high enough. If you look at India's demand growth, I was just visiting my wife's relatives in Bihar. We're still getting power outages, right? So we need to actually accelerate our adoption, our demand side, particularly in countries, in states like Bihar and UP and Chhattisgarh, for example. To give an example, Australia, 40% of rooftops have solar. In India, it's less than 1%. So there's huge demand growth on that side. On the innovation side, I think as he mentioned, the module manufacturing, we're certainly getting there. I think innovation, there's a lot more we can do. I meet a lot of startups working on perovskites and other kind of novel technologies. I'd love to see kind of more support for those. We've got a company, for example, in our portfolio called RenCube, which does what's called optical trackers. So without kind of the mechanical systems, they can shift the solar to the morning and the evening peaks when it's much more needed. But as Sri said, there's no economic incentive for that right now, right? We need market-based systems that incentivize that evening and morning production. Similarly with storage, we're seeing a lot of storage tenders, and it's really fantastic to see. Later in the day we've got a session on storage, so I won't jump into that too much. I'm talking to this great company called Main Electric, which is doing iron flow batteries, right? So long duration energy storage, they can shift and really have paka 24/7 power from solar, and also mitigates your transmission issue, right? Because now I can put 3,000 megawatts of solar on a 1,000 megawatt transmission line if I've got long duration energy storage to shift it, right? But again, we're still working on the prices. We need things like CFDs. We need things like least cost resource adequacy planning. We need the discoms to start comparing storage and solar and wind directly to thermal power on a cost, like to apples basis. We need to start seeing grid forming inverters so that solar can do its part to provide synthetic inertia and to provide support to the grid. So a lot of these pieces need to come together. But at the high level, I mean, we see folks like them doing a fantastic job building so much solar. We see the land, we see the state governments. I think 300 gigawatts is, as I said, if anything, we can blast right through and do even more.
Okay, so we'll come to those specifics. Before that, let me understand from Mr. Iyer. India already has got a very record low tariff, and we reached that at rupees 2 per kilowatt hour in 2020 when SCCI had gone for its auctions. Now the industry is standing at a different scenario where you have facing high module costs, and this is partly due to the anti-dumping duties on solar glass, and China's reduction in export rebates on solar modules. We have a huge dependence on China for that matter. So my question to you is, are low tariffs viable any longer? I mean, low tariffs are important because it entices the customer, but how does it impact the investors on the other side? Yeah, and what do you do about it?
Yeah, interesting question. So first is, one fact that we all need to get used to from now on is that solar modules are based on commodities. And like every other commodity, it's going to go through its ups and downs. So my background is in oil and gas and petrochemicals, and I was used to saying it's not $60 crude for 20 years. It's not. And unfortunately, the solar module pricing dynamics or cost dynamics go through exactly the same as any other commodity sector. In fact, only yesterday I read polysilicon prices have gone up 40%. And what most people tend to forget is between 21 and 23, solar polysilicon prices were almost 3x what they were today. We tend to always focus on the last 6 months and say, oh, module prices were so cheap. Yeah, but they were really expensive just before then. So for us as developers, we need to have a point of view on what do we think the price is going to be when we install it, because we fix the tariff 12 months before we even start the installation. There's been a lot of dynamics on, obviously, solar module pricing. If I had built based on a year's back pricing, I probably would have still got a tariff of ₹2.25 and still, made the investors happy. It's going to be difficult to do that now, obviously, with ALMM and ADD and so on and so forth. On the flip side, the new modules and the new technologies, the generation is higher because technology is improved, so that offsets part of the higher cost. And some of the other components are also starting to get a little cheaper, right? And so it's hard to look at just modules. Yeah, modules are 60%. Yeah, modules are about 60% of the cost of solar. However, I think expecting a long-term equilibrium tariff of less than 250, 260 is probably not a viable idea. So I think that's probably going to form the floor of where solar sits long-term. It's hard to go back to rupee 99. Thanks. Hard to go back to the rupee 99 tariff, which is actually a good thing because I think those were unreasonable in terms of investor expectations as well.
So what could be the solution? I mean, is the industry already taking it up with the government on this matter? Where have we reached?
I think government has limited role to play in this, obviously, because all we can ask for the government is a sense of certainty, policy certainty. What we don't want is for ADD to be X today and X plus 2 tomorrow and X times 3 months from now, which the government is not doing. If you can get certainty for 25 years, everything gets baked in. However, the volatility comes because we rely on commodities. So there's nothing the Indian government or any other government can do to polysilicon prices globally. That's one part of it. That's the cost part of it. The flip side that, again, is not discussed often enough is, I'm going to call it loosely, the lack of conduct among the private players in India who drive tariffs down to levels that are unsustainable for anybody, right? In fact, there's multiple examples in the solar space where tariffs didn't even justify the cost, and we are seeing that in recent battery bids around India for the last 6 months where the battery tariffs probably don't even cover the capex, right? So that's what I call conduct among the sector, where the private players, for whatever incentives they have, drive it down so that serious investors don't come in and serious players don't come in, and that actually hinders long-term investment because the investor community looks at that and says, how do I ever cover capital cost and a return? And so the conduct is something the Indian government can't regulate, obviously, but that will happen over time as, let's say, players tend to get disciplined. On the cost side, again, there's little the government can do other than offer a sense of certainty and consistency over time.
Yeah, I think I want to add a little bit to that. I mean, the module cost may be 60%, but the cell cost is about 30% of the cost of a project, right? And that's a commodity that's based on basically polysilicon. I think we keep waiting for prices to go down. They're not going to go down anymore, right? Or at least not substantially down. If solar is 2.5 and it's gone up from 2 to 2.5 because of the BCD and ALMM, and let's say storage is another 2, the adder, right? So solar plus storage firm is 4.5. We're building new coal plants at 7. So why are we asking solar storage, please get cheaper? 4.5 is not cheap enough. Please go to 4.3, please go to 4.2, right? We need to say to the DISCOM, rather than building new coal at 7, you can build this at 4.5. Let's start buying this. Similarly, we see the similar issue with Rooftop, where the DISCOMs say, oh, well, I can buy utility scale at 2.5, so I only want to pay 2.5 for Rooftop. But of course, in the case of Rooftop, I'm saving my transmission, I'm saving my distribution. So, maybe the DISCOM should be willing to pay 3.2 or 3.5 for Rooftop. Whereas most DISCOMs, a lot of DISCOMs in the country, say, I'm not going to pay that much for surplus Rooftop. So I think solar is cheap enough. Absolutely, there's innovations. I mentioned a couple of our companies. Maybe it can come down a little bit. But, inflation is 4% a year, just generally, right? So we should expect prices to go up 4%. If innovation decreases at 4%, then it will stay flat, right? So let's be happy with the price we have and say it's already cheaper than the alternatives. It's time to deploy now.
You're being very diplomatic. I mean, so you're happy with the present prices, but you wouldn't mind the prices if they go higher. I mean, at the end of the day.
I mean, I'm just saying the prices could go quite a bit higher and they'd still be cheaper than coal. So we need to stop comparing solar to some hopeful vision of the future where maybe it's slightly cheaper and start comparing it to pragmatically what are our alternatives today. I mean, look at gas, look at nuclear. I love hydro. I used to work for a hydro utility for 5 years, but India only has so much hydro potential. You look at the cost of nuclear, it's 7, 8 rupees a kilowatt hour. You look at the cost of gas, it's 12, 15 rupees a kilowatt hour. So we keep comparing solar to past solar and saying, okay, well, it's come down this much. Can it keep going down? Rather than comparing it to the alternatives.
So that the market forces decide. I want to come to a very important scheme, and Mr. Iyer, I want to take this question to you. Already some 14,000 crore has been allocated to manufacturers for the PLI scheme. And PLI scheme across the board, we have found it's been a mixed bag. How would you rate the success of the scheme specifically for the solar sector? Because we keep talking about creating a self-dependency for a whole lot of products, including renewables, and it's extremely important when we need to control the cost of our inputs. So, could throw some light on this.
Yeah, I think the PLI has been a success in India. Today, our module manufacturing capacity, nominal capacity, is about 100 gigawatts already, significantly higher than what the demand is. Cell capacity is, I'd say again, nominal is about 10 to 15 gigawatts, expected to grow to 50. So I think what that scheme has really done is to incentivize people to invest in capacity. I think what's perhaps the next step that needs to be added on is, as you talk to people who invest in cell capacity, is not enough thought and effort and investment in technology development. Every line that you put today is at risk of becoming obsolete within 24 months. And so to expect somebody to say, I want to put $50 million, $100 million, and 2 years from now it may be old-fashioned and not be able to meet the market needs is a huge risk. And that's what China has done, I'd say, admirably. And I'm talking in the global context, not just an Asian context, is not only have they scaled up capacity rapidly, more rapidly than any other country in the world, but they've scaled up technology development to meet that capacity scale up. They are always at the cutting edge of new technology, whether it's solar cells, or whether it's batteries, in terms of capacity and battery chemistries. And I think that's the next step for India to take. It's one thing to say, I'm going to import the technology and import the know-how and build it, but 24 months from now, you have to more or less set it aside and say, what's next? So I really hope the Indian government starts to focus on that in terms of private-public partnerships or industry, academia, consortium to help develop that technology in-house as well, because that's really the key. It's not just adding capacity.
Would you like to add to that? Just wanted to understand, what are some of the hurdles in expanding, scaling up solar energy in this country from the vantage point that you are there, what more can we do?
Okay, yeah, these are two very different questions. So one, I think absolutely investing in R&D. I think supporting, I work with a lot of early stage folks who can get, 50 lakh, 25 lakh from these startup programs, which is fine if I want to build an app. But if I want to build a sodium-ion battery manufacturing line or a perovskite manufacturing line, I need 20, 30, 40 crore. I need access to low-cost debt. I need access to into land reforms and to all these things that we talk about in terms of manufacturing more generally. And I do think we need to be investing in ITs and ISCs, but also collaborating abroad. When China built this ecosystem, they had their scholars go to Australia, go to Germany, and learn about the technology, and then bring it back and scale it in China. How many Indian engineers are going to go study in China and learning from the Chinese manufacturing, right? A little bit, but we need a lot more. In terms of scaling, I think the biggest thing, as I said, is least cost resource adequacy planning. We need the discoms to start taking renewable energy seriously, and when they're evaluating the demand growth, saying what combination, and it's not solar alone, it's going to be wind. We've got a panel on wind and a panel on storage later today, so I don't want to go into that too much. But what combination of solar and wind and storage can reliably meet our demand? We need a lot more nuance on this thinking about grid operations. So, there's no primary reserve market in India. We have capped the market rate at 10. So market reforms to reward and incentivize ancillary services, to reward and incentivize synthetic inertia, to reward and incentivize solar farms to be good grid actors, which we're getting a little bit. We're starting to enforce the grid code at least, so that at least the under frequency tripping should be behind us, I hope. But the next level is talking about these things like primary reserves and grid inertia, which we're seeing in UK and we're seeing in Australia and we're seeing in other countries, where once they reach a level of solar penetration, we need to start expecting, and that might cost a little bit more. Maybe your solar project with a grid forming inverter costs 2.55 instead of 2.5. And that's okay. We need to be willing to pay that extra 5 paisa to have a resource that is reliable and supportive of the grid.
Okay. Mr. Iyer, I wanted to come to you on something that you have touched upon when you talked about earlier, and this is regarding the grid intake. There have been reports that, the power grid is struggling to actually absorb the surge in, renewable installations that are happening. And this is going to go up because, we have got a very ambitious target. And you think that this is a real problem, ensuring grid stability? And how do we do that? And alongside comes the question again, which you touched upon briefly on the, energy storage readiness that we need to improve.
I think it's perhaps a little unfair to lay blame on the grid. Look at it from their perspective. I put $10 billion on the ground and it's used 8 hours a day. If I were to go to any investor and say, I'm going to put your dollars down and use it only a third of the time, they'll kick me out of the room, right? Unfortunately, that's the situation we find ourselves in today. And the more solar we build, the worse the problem is going to get from recovering an investment. And Alexander already mentioned, the more solar you put, the more stress you're going to place on the grid anyway. Fortunately, what we're seeing now is serious thought being given to how do you utilize that same grid for the other 16 hours by crafting tenders so that you evacuate only during peak hours, only during off-peak hours. So you can still add renewable energy capacity to the same grid infrastructure without asking for an expansion of grid and transmission. So there's still a lot of, I'm going to call it unused capacity that needs to first be utilized before we run and invest tens of billions of dollars to build additional transmission lines. So I think that's part of what needs to be done. And we are starting to see that. And Alexander mentioned it, and we have a project in the UK we're going to start off, which provides basically either peak shifting or ancillary services. I don't know exactly analytically, one could calculate it, but if renewables get to be about 40 to 45% of the energy of the system, you're going to have battery or something provide ancillary services to the grid without causing major problems. And we are starting to see that already. What we are starting to see is batteries to shift the peak from daytime to off-peak hours, but we're not starting to see an ancillary market come up yet, and I'm pretty sure it will. It's a matter of time. But the rapid buildup of battery tenders, I think, is a very positive sign. Now, once those projects start to get executed and start to operate, I think we'll all learn a lot more about how to, A, utilize the grid better, and B, how to manage the grid variability due to renewables a little better.
Okay. Mr. Hogeveen-Rutter, you want to add to that on storage solution?
Yeah, I mean, I can go on for hours, and we've only got 5 minutes left. So, but I mean, the simple answer is storage. I think we need different types of storage, whether it's grid-forming inverters, whether it's batteries, whether it's long-duration storage. But I'll give it a simple example. If I've got 2,000 megawatts of solar and only 1,000 megawatts of demand, now I've got 1,000 megawatts of excess solar at the peak time, right? If I had 1,000 megawatts of coal, that's going to make it worse because my coal minimum loading is 600. So now instead of 1,000 excess, I've got 1,600 excess. And yet I've got Discom saying, well, I need base load because I need to meet my evening peak. And I say, you don't need base load. You need to meet your evening peak. Conversely, if I put in storage, if I put in 1,000 megawatts of storage, I'm actually going to absorb that excess solar. So my excess solar problem goes away, and I can still meet my evening peak with that storage. So, I think we need to be careful that we're looking at it not just from the project perspective, but looking at it from the system perspective. And I mean, I come from a hydro utility, so I always say, no, India doesn't have surplus solar during the day. India has surplus coal during the day, right? The coal can't back down during the day, whereas hydro or storage can, right? So I think it's, we need more systems thinking. Right now, we're just looking at these projects in isolation. We're saying, that solar plant is causing the curtailment. rather than saying, what mix of options do I need? What planning does the DISCOM need to do? What planning do CNI customers need to do to create a mix or a basket of resources that meets my evening peak and provides a good level of reliability and also is a good grid steward? And it's going to be battery storage, a lot of that. It's going to be some LDES. It's going to be some synchronous condensers, maybe. It's going to be more wind. We need way more wind. And it might be some solar thermal for our industrial heat. It's got to be a mix of things, and we need to look at it from the holistic systems perspective.
Okay. So before we end, I mean, we have 5 more minutes to go, and I just wanted to bring about a topic that has been very often discussed and which has really caught on also, is the rooftop solar scheme, which you briefly referred to. But, there are reports of mixed success as far as that is concerned. I mean, the latest report says we have in July, as of July, we had only 13% of the targeted 1 crore solar rooftop installations under the PM Surya Ghar Yojana scheme has really been achieved. And only 14% of the allocated 65,700 crore has been released. So do you think that, we need to have a relook at the way we implement the scheme, although it's a very, very exciting scheme?
Yeah, I think it's essential. I'm not going to say it's important. Actually, for India to reach its target and even to make it more efficient, I think rooftop solar has to be a critical component of how we move forward. 2 things need to happen in parallel with that. Now, clearly the policy is in place, the rules are in place. We need to figure out how DISCOMs in the grid deal with distributed generation, and how do they deal with power that can either be imported or exported from every individual installation. I think the rules there and the regulations and the policies need to be clarified. Second is technology to manage what we call the prosumer, right? How do you make sure that you don't cause problems to the DISCOM and to the grid to make it happen? And thirdly, again, as I think Alexander mentioned it, the pricing that the DISCOMs pay for this during the daytime hours when there's net metering, they need some market mechanisms to say it's actually worth a lot more than you're willing to pay. And if you do that, then you'll see an increased interest from people as well to say, look, in that case, on an annual basis, I could be, I'd say, cost neutral, right? And we actually see that in places like California and Arizona, where in the US, where people are essentially on an annual basis cost zero, right? But because market mechanisms exist there to make it so. So I think if we can focus on these 3, we'll be there. The CNI sector has done exceedingly well with rooftop solar, but even they face limits because of regulatory barriers in any given state. And if those are lifted, I think even they have a high incentive to move and increase their rooftop.
Could you please specify the regulatory hurdles when you talk, the approvals, or what do you really mean?
It's in terms of how much they are allowed to put relative to their total demand, right? And there's very strict rules as to what % of rooftop they can have relative to their total load. If you were to, I'd say, make that a little more flexible or release some of those constraints, you'd start to see a lot of the CNI guys obviously install more rooftop. On the flip side, the CNI are the DISCOM's most valuable customers, right? So the DISCOM's financial incentive to let them lose is also a little, one has to look at that from the DISCOM's angle as well.
Mr. Hogeveen-Rutter, you have
I mean, the approval, certainly getting the NOC from the DISCOM, I really liked an analysis recently that said, one of the reasons Australia has been so much more successful in the US is that US treats every solar rooftop like a utility asset. Australia treats every rooftop like an appliance. And I think that shift in the regulatory process, with the caveat that we do want smart inverters so that they're good grid actors, we do want proper price signals so that we're paying enough for solar to incentivize surplus, but not so much that the DISCOM's taking a loss. I'd love to see, I mean, this is, and in India we've got the national versus state, electricity is a dual subject, so it's challenging. I'd love to see the center step in a little bit more and say, we're going to set a minimum national tariff floor, right? Like you saw in Vietnam, for example, where we will pay 3 rupees a kilowatt hour for every unit of excess produced. And then we will sort out through SECI or some other central entity how to sell it to the DISCOM and how to purchase in the market. So there's things you can do, but at the end of the day, it's a state subject. So you have to go state by state and say, what is your process for doing an NOC? How can we simplify that? What is your limit and your cap? what is your net metering or your net billing tariff look like? And at some point, we need to solve it 29 times, unfortunately. We can't just solve it once.
So excellent. Thank you so much, gentlemen. A big round of applause for both the gentlemen out here. You know, we have had a discussion on what exactly can be done. You know, we are optimistic, but you know, we also need to ensure that some of these gaps need to be filled. Thank you so much.